You are a German Field Marshal. Your world has ended in the dust of Tunisia. You, a commander of the vaunted Afrika Korps, are now a prisoner. You brace for humiliation, for starvation, the fate your own regime inflicts on its captives. But the journey across the ocean on an American ship is strangely efficient. You land in a humid place they call Mississippi, and then you are handed a simple metal tray. On it is a meal that is, impossibly, better than the state banquets you attended in Berlin. In that moment, the war changes. This was not a war of single, heroic duels between panzers. It was a war of attrition, and in the scorched landscape of North Africa in May of 1943, the German war machine had been ground down to its last bolt. The end was not a glorious climactic battle. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation under a mountain of Allied steel and logistics. For the veterans of the Afrika Korps, men who had mastered the desert and outmaneuvered their opponents with tactical brilliance, the final weeks were a brutal lesson in modern warfare. Their genius meant little against an enemy that could lose a Sherman M4A1 tank and have 3 more roll off a ship to replace it the next day. The skies, once contested, now belonged to the Allies. Every supply truck, every ammunition dump was a target. The German soldier, praised by his Reich's propaganda as the pinnacle of martial virtue, could do nothing but dig deeper into the sand and wait for the inevitable. The capitulation, when it came, was staggering. Near Bizerte and Tunis, an entire army group simply ceased to exist. Roughly 250,000 seasoned Axis soldiers, the pride of Germany and Italy, laid down their arms. Among them were thousands of officers, including the very man who had inherited the mantle of the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. For these men, surrender was a concept they had been taught to despise. It was a failure not just of arms, but of will, of character. They were products of an ideology that celebrated victory or a glorious death, with no room for anything in between. As they were disarmed and marched into holding pens, they saw an enemy that did not fit the caricatures they had been fed. The American GIs were not the soft, undisciplined cowboys of Goebbels' newsreels. They were organized, efficient, almost disturbingly professional. There were no mass reprisals, no wanton cruelty. There was paperwork. There were processing lines. There was a cold, calculated system for dealing with a defeated army. This efficiency was the first unsettling clue that they had profoundly misunderstood their foe. Soon this industrial-scale management of men would take on an even more daunting form. The Allies had a problem: tens of thousands of enemy prisoners on a continent they still had to conquer. The solution was as audacious as it was unprecedented. They would not be interned in Africa. They would be shipped across the Atlantic. The great gears of American logistics began to turn, preparing to move an entire captured army to the continental United States. For the German officers watching from the docks of Algiers, the sight of the harbor was a revelation. Ship after ship, a seemingly endless conveyor belt of liberty ships and troop transports like the USS Monterey, steamed into port. They had fought a war of scarcity, counting every bullet and every liter of fuel. The Americans fought a war of abundance. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was an ideological one. The first weapon to disarm the minds of the Third Reich's elite wasn't a book on democracy. It was the simple, overwhelming spectacle of a nation that could move mountains of men and material across an ocean as if it were a triviality. The journey across the Atlantic was a new kind of warfare, one fought not with explosives but with perception. As the senior German officers, including von Arnim himself, were escorted up the gangplank, They were entering a world designed and built by their enemy. The steel decks of the USS Monterey were clean. The sailors moved with a purpose that was not born of fear, but of training and routine. There was no shouting, no overt hostility. Instead, there was an almost bureaucratic calmness to the process of ingesting thousands of defeated men into the ship's belly. This was profoundly unnerving. Cruelty they understood. Hatred they expected. This detached, systemic handling of human beings felt alien, industrial. It was the same relentless efficiency they had witnessed on the docks, now afloat. Confined to their quarters, the officers had little to do but observe and reflect. They were kept separate from the enlisted prisoners, a nod to the articles of the Geneva Convention that their own high command often treated as a quaint suggestion. 3 times a day they were fed. The meals were not lavish, but they were substantial, balanced, and regular. For men who had spent months subsisting on dwindling, ersatz rations in the desert, the simple reality of fresh bread, meat, and even coffee was a shock. It spoke not of luxury, but of a supply chain so robust, so utterly dominant, that it could afford to feed its enemies well, even in the middle of an ocean. This quiet demonstration of power was more demoralizing than any propaganda speech. Every full stomach was a testament to the Reich's strategic failure. The days bled into one another, marked only by the changing light on the churning gray water. The Atlantic was immense, a physical barrier that mirrored the psychological chasm, now separating them from their former lives. They were no longer commanders shaping the destiny of nations. They were cargo, logged in a ship's manifest, being transported to a destination unknown. Their maps, their strategies, their entire understanding of the world had ended at the water's edge. Now they were adrift, subject to the whims and the timetables of their captors. When land was finally sighted, it wasn't the scarred, war-torn coastline of Europe. It was America, green, vast, and untouched. The ports they sailed into were not smoldering ruins, but bustling hives of industry, a continuation of the spectacle they had seen in Algiers, but on a continental scale. As they disembarked, the same process began anew. Columns of men, guards, paperwork, and an overwhelming sense of order. From the port, they were loaded onto trains. For hours, then days, they traveled deeper into the heart of the country they were supposed to bring to its knees. They rolled past endless fields of crops, past towns where life seemed to be proceeding with an unnerving normality, past factories that pulsed with a 24-hour rhythm of production. This was the engine room of the Allied war effort, and it was clear to the German command staff, staring out through the windows, that they had never stood a chance. The war they had fought was a world away. Here, the only sign of conflict was the uniform of their guards. Finally, the train shuddered to a halt in the deep south. The air that hit them as they stepped onto the platform was thick, wet, and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. This was Clinton, Mississippi. Before them stood their new home, Camp Clinton, a sprawling, purpose-built facility enclosed by barbed wire and watchtowers. It was a prison, but like everything else they had seen, it was new, orderly, and built to last. The physical journey was over. The true battle for their hearts and minds was about to begin. Camp Clinton was not a place of punishment. It was a place of procedure. As the German officers were marched through the gates, they were met not with jeers or threats, but with another layer of methodical administration. This was a dedicated facility, designed and built with a singular purpose: to house the enemy's command structure securely and efficiently. The barracks were simple wooden structures, but they were solid, weatherproof, and clean. There were designated areas for recreation, study, and dining. It was a small, self-contained town, governed by a set of rules that would prove to be the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal, the Articles of the 1929 Geneva Convention. To the German command, this was a document of theoretical importance, a gentleman's agreement to be observed when convenient. To the Americans running Camp Clinton, it was the operational manual. This meant that officers were not to be treated as common criminals. They were to be afforded housing separate from enlisted men, granted a degree of autonomy within the camp, and most critically, provided with rations equivalent to those of American soldiers of the same rank. This adherence to international law was the first and most profound shock. They had been indoctrinated to believe that in total war, such civilities were the first casualty, a sign of weakness. Yet here, in the heartland of their enemy, the rules were being followed with an almost religious devotion. This wasn't weakness. It was a display of profound, unshakable confidence. The first assault on their ideology came not from a lecture on the virtues of democracy, but from the clatter of cutlery on metal trays in the officers' mess hall. The room itself was unremarkable: long wooden tables, benches, a serving line. It lacked the pomp and ceremony of the state functions in Berlin, the polished silver and eagle-emblazoned porcelain. It was a place for sustenance, not for show. Field Marshal von Arnim, a man accustomed to the pinnacle of the Reich society, took his place among his subordinates. He was a prisoner, yet he was still a commander, and his men watched him, looking for cues on how to comport themselves in this new, humiliating reality. Then came the food. It was served on plain, sectioned metal trays by American enlisted men. There was no ceremony, but what was on the trays was revolutionary. It wasn't the canned, preserved fare of a frontline unit. It was real food: baked chicken, potatoes, fresh vegetables, a slice of white bread with a pat of butter, and a steaming mug of actual coffee. The sight, the smell, the very substance of it was a paradox. In Germany, the civilian population was already feeling the strain of rationing. At the front, the Wehrmacht was running on ersatz coffee and dwindling supplies. Even at the highest levels, true quality was becoming a memory. Yet here, in a prison camp thousands of miles from the fighting, the Americans could provide this without apparent effort. Von Arnim took a bite. The surprise must have registered on his face. The quiet murmuring among the other officers confirmed they were all experiencing the same cognitive dissonance. It was simple, unadorned, and undeniably delicious. It was then that he reportedly uttered the words that perfectly captured the moment's significance. Looking down at his simple meal, the commander of the Afrika Korps remarked to a fellow officer that it tasted better than the official banquets they had been forced to attend back in Germany. It was a quiet, almost casual observation, but it was an ideological earthquake. A state banquet in the Third Reich was pure theater, designed to project power and invincibility, but the quality of the food was often secondary to the spectacle. Here, with no spectacle at all, the sheer quality of the meal spoke of a power that was real, tangible, and seemingly inexhaustible. It was the power of a nation that could feed itself, its armies, its allies, and its prisoners, all at the same time. In that Mississippi mess hall, the myth of the brittle, decaying West began to die. That first meal was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a relentless, daily campaign. The psychological impact was cumulative. Every breakfast, every lunch, every dinner was a quiet refutation of the world they knew. The German officers had been forged in a culture of sacrifice and stoicism, where hardship was a virtue and deprivation was the expected cost of total war. Their entire national narrative was built on the idea of a heroic struggle against encirclement, against enemies who sought to starve and strangle the fatherland. American policy at Camp Clinton systematically dismantled this narrative, not through argument, but through abundance. The camp's quartermasters did not simply meet the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention. They followed the standard U.S. Army ration tables. This meant the German prisoners were eating the same food in the same quantities as the American soldiers guarding them. This principle of equity was incomprehensible. It defied the logic of conqueror and conquered. In the Nazi worldview, the defeated were to be exploited, their resources stripped to fuel the victor's war machine. The idea of diverting one's own resources to care for a captured enemy was seen as absurd, a strategic blunder. Yet the Americans did it day after day. The prisoners soon realized this wasn't a temporary show for their benefit. It was simply the system. They were a cog in a vast logistical machine that was programmed for a certain standard, and that standard was surprisingly high. There were stories of German generals being stunned by the availability of items they considered extreme luxuries: ice cream, fresh milk, real eggs. These were not weapons of war, but they served a similar purpose. Each scoop of ice cream was a small, edible symbol of a nation with a surplus of everything: dairy, sugar, refrigeration, and the industrial capacity to deliver it all to a prison camp in Mississippi. This material wealth began to force a difficult reevaluation. If the propaganda was wrong about something as basic as food, what else was it wrong about? The image of America as a nation hollowed out by the Great Depression, a mongrel society on the brink of collapse, simply could not be reconciled with the reality of this endless bounty. It created a deep-seated unease among the officer corps. Their arrogance, a core component of their professional identity, began to erode. They had been captured by an enemy they had been taught to underestimate, and every aspect of their captivity demonstrated just how profound that underestimation had been. The American camp commanders were not naive idealists. This policy of humane treatment was a deliberate strategy. It was a form of soft power long before the term was coined. The goal was not merely to warehouse prisoners until the war was over. It was to begin the long, slow process of de-Nazification. By treating the prisoners with a decency their own regime denied its victims, the Americans created a powerful moral contrast. Cruelty would have been easy. It would have reinforced the Nazi belief that all nations were driven by the same brutal impulses, and that Germany was simply better at it. Fairness, adherence to law, and basic human dignity, these were the truly alien concepts. They were a quiet challenge, forcing the prisoners to confront the nature of the system they had served. It was a subtle but devastatingly effective form of psychological warfare. The battle was no longer for a hilltop in Tunisia. It was for the intellectual and moral territory inside the minds of the German leadership. And the opening salvos were being fired from the camp kitchen. As the initial shock of their new circumstances subsided, a routine settled over Camp Clinton, but it was a routine that continuously chipped away at the foundations of the prisoner's worldview. The material comfort, anchored by the consistent quality of the food, created a space for something far more dangerous to the Nazi state than physical rebellion: introspection. With the daily struggle for survival removed, the German officers were left with an abundance of time and the disquieting evidence of their nation's strategic miscalculation. The camp authorities actively encouraged intellectual pursuits. They established a library, stocked with books and periodicals in both German and English. Crucially, this wasn't a crude re-education program filled with obvious propaganda. The materials offered a window into the world they had been fighting to destroy. They could read American newspapers and magazines, study texts on U.S. history and civics, and engage with the principles of democratic governance. For many, this was their first unfiltered contact with the ideals of their enemy. The Nazi regime had controlled information with an iron grip, creating a closed intellectual ecosystem where dissenting ideas were not just forbidden, but unthinkable. Now the walls of that ecosystem had been breached. Men who had been taught that democracy was chaotic and inefficient could read about a system that, for all its noisy debates and internal disagreements, had managed to mobilize a continent spanning economy and project its power across two oceans. This intellectual engagement was complemented by the prisoners' interactions with the camp staff. The American guards were, by and large, not zealots. They were citizen soldiers, carrying out a difficult and often tedious job with a degree of professionalism that continued to puzzle the German officers. They enforced the rules, but they did so without the sadistic cruelty that was a hallmark of the SS-run camps in Europe. This consistent, rule-bound behavior was a living demonstration of a different kind of authority, one based on law, not on the arbitrary whims of a powerful few. A slow transformation began to take hold. Conversations in the barracks shifted from reminiscences of past battles to cautious debates about the future. What had gone wrong? Not just tactically in Africa, but strategically, from the very beginning. How could a nation as powerful as the United States have been so misunderstood? The study of American history revealed a pattern of industrial might and latent military power that German intelligence had either ignored or deliberately downplayed. Reading about the American Civil War, for instance, offered a stark lesson in how a democratic nation could endure immense internal conflict and emerge stronger, a concept alien to the totalitarian demand for absolute unity. The prisoners began to form study groups, to hold lectures for one another. A German general who had been a professor before the war might give a talk on economics, which would inevitably lead to a discussion of how Germany's command economy had been outmatched by American capitalism. The camp became an impromptu high-level university of defeat. Von Arnim himself, a product of the rigid Prussian military aristocracy, was seen poring over books, wrestling with the new ideas that confronted him daily. This process was not a sudden conversion. It was a gradual, painful peeling away of layers of indoctrination. For every officer who began to question the Reich, there were others who clung fiercely to their beliefs, dismissing the fair treatment as a trick. But the evidence was relentless. The quiet competence of the camp's administration, the sheer logistical power represented by every meal, and the open access to information all worked in concert. The Americans were not telling them that their ideology was wrong. They were simply creating an environment where the prisoners could discover that fact for themselves. It was a strategy of immense patience, built on the conviction that reality, when presented clearly and consistently, is the most effective antidote to propaganda. The strategy employed at Camp Clinton represented a profound divergence from the nature of the war being fought elsewhere. While bombers were leveling German cities and vast armies were clashing on the Eastern Front, the conflict in this corner of Mississippi was almost entirely nonviolent. It was a war of ideas, and the primary American weapon was the consistent application of their own stated values. This approach was not without its critics back home. In a nation fully mobilized for total war, where sons and husbands were dying overseas, the idea of treating captured enemy generals to meals better than what some American families could afford was controversial. Newspapers occasionally ran stories questioning the coddling of prisoners. But the military leadership understood the long-term strategic value. These captured officers were not just defeated soldiers. They were the potential future leaders of a post-war Germany. Shattering their belief in National Socialism was as important as shattering a panzer division. By demonstrating the strength and decency of the democratic system, the United States was laying the groundwork for a stable and peaceful Europe once the fighting stopped. The German officers were, in essence, the first subjects in a massive experiment in de-Nazification. The results were not uniform, but they were significant. The rigid, arrogant facade of the Prussian officer corps began to show cracks. Men who had arrived as true believers in the Reich's destiny started to speak a different language. They began to use words like responsibility and misjudgment when discussing the war. The focus of their studies shifted from military history to political philosophy. They weren't just learning about their enemy, they were learning about alternative ways a modern state could be organized. This intellectual journey was deeply personal for each man. It meant confronting the possibility that they had dedicated their lives and sacrificed the lives of their men for a criminal enterprise. It was a devastating realization, one that some could not accept. But for many, the overwhelming evidence presented by their daily lives in the camp became impossible to ignore. The system that fed them, clothed them, and allowed them the freedom to read and debate was palpably more resilient and humane than the one they had served. The success of this soft power approach became evident as the war in Europe drew to a close in 1945. As news of the Reich's final collapse and the horrific revelations of the concentration camps reached Camp Clinton, the prisoners had a framework to understand it. They were not shocked into disbelief like much of the German populace, who had been shielded by propaganda. They had spent 2 years in an environment that had slowly prepared them for the truth. They had seen firsthand that the enemy was not the subhuman monster of their government's propaganda, which made it easier to believe that their own government was capable of monstrous acts. And when the time came for repatriation, the men who left Camp Clinton were not the same men who had entered. Their military bearing was still intact, but their ideological certainty was gone. They had been defeated twice, once by the overwhelming material power of the Allies in Tunisia, and a second time by the quiet, persistent moral and intellectual power of their captors in Mississippi. They returned to a Germany in ruins, a nation that needed to be rebuilt not just physically, but spiritually. The lessons learned in the mess halls and libraries of Camp Clinton, the slow dawning realization that strength did not have to mean brutality, would be a small but vital seed for the future democracy that would rise from the ashes of the Third Reich. The story of Camp Clinton and the captured generals of the Afrika Korps is more than a historical curiosity. It is a profound lesson in the nature of modern conflict. It demonstrates that the most enduring victories are not always won on the battlefield. The surrender of von Arnim's army in May of 1943 was a significant military achievement, marking the end of the North African campaign. But the subsequent internment of its leadership was a strategic masterstroke, a campaign fought with different weapons for a far greater prize, the future of a nation's soul. The United States chose a path of enlightened self-interest. By strictly adhering to the Geneva Convention, they did more than uphold international law. They waged a quiet, relentless war against the very ideology that fueled their enemy. The Nazi worldview was predicated on a cynical belief that all human interaction is a struggle for dominance, that might makes right, and that compassion is a weakness to be exploited. Every fair trial, every adequate ration, and every uncensored book at Camp Clinton was a direct assault on that belief. The simple, well-prepared meal that tasted better than a state banquet was not an accident of logistics. It was the physical manifestation of a system that worked. It represented a society capable of producing such abundance that it could afford to be decent, even to its bitterest enemies. This was a concept the German command staff, products of a system built on plunder and scarcity, could barely comprehend. Their initial arrogance and ideological certainty slowly gave way to a grudging respect, and for many, a fundamental re-examination of their core beliefs. This was not a story of weakness, but of a different, more formidable kind of strength. It was the strength of a nation so confident in its principles that it was willing to apply them universally. It was the strength of a system that could defeat its enemies not only with tanks and bombers, but with the quiet power of its own example. When the war ended, and the German officers were returned to their shattered homeland, they carried with them an experience that would be invaluable. They had seen, up close, that the world was not the simple, brutal place their Führer had described. They had learned that a nation could be powerful without being cruel, and orderly without being oppressive. In the monumental task of rebuilding Germany as a stable, democratic partner in the post-war world, the quiet lessons learned over a meal tray in a Mississippi prison camp played their small but crucial part. The war was won not just when the last shot was fired, but when the minds of the enemy were finally and peacefully disarmed.